Forgotten Park. 1986 year. Summer evening in a small town. As the last rays of the sun began to disappear over the horizon, Tommy, Lisa, Mark and Sarah stood on the threshold of a long-forgotten amusement park. They grew up together, spending many evenings telling each other scary stories, but none of them compared to what awaited them that night. Amusement park Luna Park was the pride of their town in the 1960s. But the park was closed after a horrific incident in which a train car derailed during a storm, killing several people. Since then it has stood empty, overgrown with grass and tangled with ivy. Local residents avoided it and children told stories about the ghosts that settled there. Lisa, the bravest of the whole company, said, "Well, guys, are you ready?" Her voice was calm, but her eyes flashed with anxiety. Mark, who was always skeptical, shook his head but still nodded. "I don't believe in ghosts, but if it helps you, let's go," he said. Sarah, who was always quiet, stood a little behind. She felt something strange, as if this park was not just abandoned, but abandoned for some reason that no one wants to talk about. Tommy, the leader of the group, raised a lantern and illuminated the dilapidated archway at the entrance. "We're already here, so let's go," he said, and took the first step inside. The atmosphere of the park changed instantly. The sounds of the outside world died down, leaving only the rustling of leaves and their own steps echoing in the empty alleys. The air seemed thicker, filled with the smell of old wooden structures and musty water channels that had once been part of the water attractions. Lisa drew attention to the old attraction, Ferris wheel, which stood swaying in the light breeze. It seemed particularly ominous to her, as if it was watching them. "Something is wrong," she said, looking at him. Tommy decided they should explore the central part of the park, where the biggest attraction, the House of Horrors, used to be. According to rumors, that is where the tragic incident took place. On the way to it, the teenagers noticed how it was getting darker and colder around them, although the summer night should be warm. They approached the House of Horrors, an old wooden building that stood on a slope. Her windows were boarded up and her door was half broken. Suddenly a light came on in the darkness, and strange sounds were heard from inside. They were not the usual mechanical screeching, but something more like a whisper coming from the walls. Tommy hesitated, but Lisa had already opened the door. "Follow me," she said quietly, and disappeared into the darkness of the House of Horrors. Mark and Sarah hesitantly followed her, while Tommy stood in the doorway, feeling an uneasy foreboding. However, after a few seconds, he also went inside. In the darkness of the building, their lanterns illuminated only the narrow corridors, the walls of which were covered with old, dusty posters with the creepy faces of clowns and monsters. The silence became almost unbearable. Only occasionally something cracked underfoot. Suddenly Lisa stopped and pointed to something in the darkness. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Everyone froze, listening to the faint sound. It was a cry, quiet and muffled, coming from the depths of the building. Tommy shuddered, but still decided to go on. Something or someone was there waiting for them. The cry came closer and closer, and its piercing sound made Lisa's skin crawl. She tried to keep herself in her hands, but her heart was beating loudly in her chest. Everyone stood still, exchanging worried glances, but no one dared to break the silence. "Maybe it's just old sounds left in the walls," Mark tried to say jokingly, but his voice was shaking. Tommy knew, as much as he didn't want to admit it, that it wasn't just any old sound. He felt that they were being watched. "We need to find out what it is," he said quietly, and moved forward, trying to ignore the fear that gripped him inside. As they progressed deeper into the House of Horrors, the corridors became more and more confusing. The light of their lanterns made out only the shabby walls and old decoration. Between the scattered mannequins depicting monsters and ghosts, shadows appeared that seemed to move on their own. "Why does it feel like we're being followed?" Sarah whispered, squeezing Lisa's hand. She had always been very sensitive to the atmosphere, and now her intuition was screaming danger. Lisa nodded silently, also noticing something wrong. Finally, they reached a large room that appeared to be the main hall of the attraction. There used to be moving scenery here, creating the illusion of scary scenes, but now everything has been destroyed. In the middle of the room stood an old wooden throne with a high back, on which lay a pile of dusty dolls. Suddenly, a silhouette emerged from behind the throne. It was a child, a girl of 7, in an old-fashioned dress. She looked pale and frightened, her eyes glistening with tears. "You shouldn't be here," she said in a low, barely audible voice. "Who are you?" Lisa asked, looking at the girl with surprise. "What are you doing here? You will all die if you don't go," the girl continued to cry, her words becoming strained. "He's back. He's coming for you." The child's words made them all freeze in place. Mark stepped forward, but suddenly felt something cold touch his hand. He turned his head with horror and saw a hand reaching out from under the dolls lying on the throne, grabbing his wrist. "Get away from her!" Tommy shouted, but it was too late. The dolls came to life, their glass eyes began to glow with an ominous red light, and they suddenly rose into the air. The girl screamed, covering her ears with her hands, but her voice was quickly drowned out by the chorus of horrible laughter and cries that came from everywhere. Mark tried desperately to break free, but the dolls held him tightly. "Run away!" he shouted to his friends, but they were paralyzed with fear. Tommy finally reacted, grabbing Sarah and Lisa's hands. "Let's run," he ordered. They began to run back through the dark corridors, leaving Mark's screams and the eerie whispers of the dolls behind. Getting back was more difficult than they thought. The corridors seemed to change, turning into a labyrinth, where every turn led to a dead end, or to even scarier rooms filled with ugly mannequins. "We can't just leave him," Lisa shouted. But Tommy knew they couldn't go back. They had to get out of here before things got worse. Suddenly they were at the exit again, but the door was locked. Sarah began pounding on them desperately, trying to open them. Lisa turned her head back and saw a girl coming towards them from the darkness. But now she was not alone. Other shadows appeared behind her, the silhouettes of those who died in this park. "You shouldn't have come here," the girl whispered. "Now, you belong to him." The door finally creaked open, and Tommy pulled the girls outside. They ran to the very exit of the park without looking back. But even on the street, they were haunted by the sound of quiet laughter coming from the House of Horrors building. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, Lisa looked at Tommy. "We've lost Mark," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Tommy hugged her, unsure of what to say. They were safe, but it wasn't a complete relief. But just when they thought it was over, they heard a sound behind them. It was a familiar song that had been playing in the park years ago. The tune was low and tinkling like a broken jukebox, and it haunted them even as they ran home. The next day, the three teenagers woke up with a terrible feeling that everything that happened was not just a nightmare. Tommy, Lisa, and Sarah gathered at Tommy's house, trying to figure out what to do next. All three looked exhausted, their faces pale and their eyes empty. "Mark, he stayed there," Lisa said with pain in her voice, clenching her fists. "We can't just sit here while Shay..." "Heil, he's there. What can we do?" "Oh," Tommy answered, feeling helpless. "We barely made it out alive ourselves." "We have to go back," Sarah said firmly. "I know it sounds crazy, but we can't leave him. What if he's still alive?" Tommy wanted to deny it, but Sarah's words stuck in his head. He knew she was right, but fear was binding his will. However, looking into her determined eyes, he felt that he could not leave his friend to fend for himself. "Okay," he finally agreed. "But we have to be careful. We have to find a way to stop whatever lives in that park." They headed back to Luna Park the next evening as darkness once again enveloped the town. Now their plan was simple: find Mark and find out what was going on in the House of Horrors. Armed with flashlights and some metal pipes they found in Tommy's backyard, they re-entered the park. The atmosphere this time was even creepier. There was no wind and everything seemed still, as if time had stopped. They quickly reached the House of Horrors. But now something was wrong. The door, which was locked yesterday, now opened wide, as if it had been expected. Lisa looked at Tommy and Sarah, trying to see if they were ready. Tommy nodded, and Sarah just squeezed Lisa's hand, forcing her to walk forward. They stepped into the darkness, their footsteps echoing again in the empty corridors. The dolls that had come to life yesterday now lay motionless, but their eyes seemed to follow every movement. As they approached the hall where they had lost Mark, the same fear began to press upon them again. In the large room where the throne stood, there were now even more dolls. They sat in a row, like spectators waiting for a performance. Tommy noticed that there were no more puppets on the throne, but now Mark was sitting there, his face pale and his eyes empty, like he wasn't himself anymore. "Mark!" Lisa shouted, rushing towards him, but Tommy stopped her, feeling that something was wrong here. "Wait," he said, holding her. "We have to be careful." But it was too late. Mark slowly raised his head and looked at them. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, only an eerie whisper that filled the room. "He came for you." The dolls suddenly came back to life, but now they didn't just rise. Their limbs began to elongate, turning into long, flexible tentacles that reached towards the teenagers. The walls began to close, creating the illusion of being trapped. Sarah was startled and rushed to run back to the exit, but the door instantly closed in front of her face. She pounded on them desperately, but it was no use. "We must find another way out," she shouted, looking around for help. Lisa jumped up and grabbed the metal pipe she had come with. "We will not give up," she said, her voice shaking, but she was ready to fight. She swung and hit the doll that was approaching her with all her might. Her body was blown apart, but that didn't stop the others. The puppets continued to approach, their faces contorted into whimsical smiles. Tommy mustered up all his courage and rushed towards Mark, trying to pull him off the throne. But something held his friend tightly and he could not break free. "We have to get out of here," Tommy shouted, but Mark didn't seem to hear him. Suddenly, the sound of loud children's laughter filled the room. A little girl appeared in the darkness, smiling, but this smile was terrible, almost not human. "You will never leave," she said, her eyes shining with dark power. "You belong to him." Suddenly, the light of the lanterns went out, and the room was plunged into absolute darkness. The last thing they heard was Mark's shrill scream before the darkness engulfed them completely. The darkness in the room was absolute. Lisa, Sarah, and Tommy once again felt the fear that could not go away before. The forces that pursued them seemed invincible. Only their nervous breathing disturbed the silence that enveloped the House of Horrors. They began to look for a way out in absolute darkness, trying to navigate by the sounds that occasionally echoed from the corridors. Liza tried to remember the route by which they entered, but fear and anxiety confused her memory more and more. Suddenly, eyes appeared in the darkness, not sinister, but brilliant, bright, which quickly approached them. It was a child's voice. "You shouldn't be here," he said, and the shadows filled the room again. Lisa felt a chill fill her heart. She realized that these were not just ghosts, but something much worse. "We have to find Mark and get out of here," Lisa said again, but her voice sounded less confident. Tommy and Sarah nodded, trying to find some logic in the chaos. They moved forward, coming across old mechanisms and abandoned scenery. Suddenly, screams and a noise were heard from the depths of the corridors, as if something big was breaking through the walls. It was a sign that something was in store for them. Tommy discovered a door that led back to the hall where they had left Mark. They opened them and went inside. The throne was empty, but an ancient book lay on the floor. Sarah walked over to it and noticed that there were strange symbols on the cover. "Maybe this is the key to everything," she said, opening the book. Lisa and Tommy moved closer, watching Sarah turn the pages. They depicted terrible rites and rituals that had the power to control shadows and spirits. "It's a spell book," Sarah said, horrified. "The rituals that keep the spirits in this place are described here." Suddenly, a new door opened and the girl's silhouette came out again, but now she was not alone. She was followed by shadows that approached them. Lisa, realizing that this was their chance, grabbed the book and began to recite the spell out loud, hoping that it would stop the monstrous forces. With each word of the book, the shadows began to recede, and the room was filled with light, which began to dispel the darkness. The forces of darkness that once filled the park began to dissipate. Tommy and Sarah grabbed Lisa's hands and together they stormed out of the room. The park began to collapse around them, as if the house itself was dying. The roads and corridors turned into chaos, but they held together, finding a way out. When they finally made it to the surface, the Luna Park behind them began to fill with silence again. The darkness retreated, and the morning light filled the town. They returned home, exhausted but alive. Mark was left in the dark, and although they could never find out what happened to him, they knew that there would be no more visitors to Luna Park in their town. The park was closed again, and in its place there was no more sound. Lisa, Tommy, and Sarah knew they had managed to stop something terrible, but the memories of that night stayed with them forever. They learned that sometimes the worst fears are not always the ones that can be seen, and although they escaped, the shadows of the past will always remain with them. So what do you think about what happened at Luna Park? What are your thoughts on what the abandoned places are really hiding? Write your impressions and theories in the comments. If you want more scary stories and scary adventures, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and press the bell to stay up to date with all the news. Thank you for being with us.